From the Toronto Star, I'm Adrian Cheung, and this matters. You might not think all that much about bylaws, and I get it. It's not the spiciest dinner conversation of all time. Unless you get a noise complaint or you're wondering if it's legal to bring a beer to the park, it might feel like bylaws, these rules and regulations passed by City Council, barely impact your life. But that's not true. Especially in this new, weird pandemic world we're all trying to figure out, bylaws are shaping the way we interact and the way we live. In Toronto, there's a new rule that says you now have to wear a mask indoors. That's a bylaw.
Today, City Council will consider a report from Dr. Eileen Davila to effectively make it mandatory for people to wear masks or face coverings inside businesses or public facilities.
What about the rule banning social gatherings of more than 10 people, keeping indoor spaces in bars and restaurants closed during stage 2, having playgrounds roped off? Bylaw, bylaw, bylaw. This summer, backed by the advice of public health experts, our idea of public space has changed. We're taking back sidewalks, streets, and parks, and new bylaws are being created right now to handle this new reality. Today, we're talking to Jennifer Pagliaro, City Hall reporter for the Toronto Star. She's been following the many changes happening down at City Hall and figuring out how they affect you. Jen, thanks for taking the time to talk.
Thanks so much for having me.
This pandemic has created conditions for new rules and new ways of living we never really thought were possible before all of this. What's your experience been like covering all the new bylaws and all the changes that are happening at City Hall every day?
It's been really fascinating to see the pace of these new rules. And I think just talking to people I know in my life, trying to keep up with what's allowed and what's not allowed at any given point in time, and how much the city is actually responsible for when it comes to people's health and safety. Every time there's a press conference, especially in the early days of the pandemic, it seemed like there was something new that we couldn't do. And now, as we're moving through the stages of reopening, we're learning what we are allowed to do again, but it comes with new restrictions. And that's something that we're really trying to help people navigate, because I think it's actually really confusing.
Yeah, I mean, this very idea of bylaws, like you were saying, that it constructs so much about how we live in a city. They regulate everything we do, from the streets to restaurants to bars to retail stores. And it's something we generally don't really think all that much about. It's not really the sexiest thing to talk about. Have we underrated how central bylaws are to maintaining the public health advice that is changing all the time?
I think something that's interesting about bylaw enforcement is, up until now, it's kind of been like public health. Something that the public health officials say is, their job is working when we don't really think about what it is that they do. And bylaw enforcement is kind of the same. Like, if things are happening as they should and people are following the rules, then we don't think too much about what those rules are necessarily or how they are supposed to be enforced. But something to think about is the head of the city's municipal licensing and standards division, which is responsible for bylaw enforcement, Carlton Grant, reminded me that they were responsible for 30 some odd bylaws before the pandemic started. And that's, like you mentioned, all kinds of things. They license businesses, different types of businesses. For example, they license taxis, nightclubs, and they're also responsible for parks, noise, and all kinds of other rules in the city. And so there are lots of things around us that are regulated in our daily lives. And maybe it's only now that there are restrictions on their regular use that we're noticing that.
What has it been like for them and for bylaw enforcement officers now?
It's been really challenging. The conversation that I had recently with Carlton, I think he was very frank about the amount of work that they're being expected to do. Like I said, there's those 30 everyday bylaws, which are still in place. And there are all these new bylaws that they're responsible for ensuring people adhere to. And they only have around 200 officers, and they are being helped by Toronto Public Health, as well as the Toronto Police in some cases, and also the AGCO, which is responsible for liquor licensing, is also stepping in now. But when you think about 200 officers in a city of 3 million people, and we have, for example, 8,000 eateries, so restaurants and bars, the numbers aren't really in enforcement's favor. And so they're really relying on people listening to the press conferences and to the media and adhering without being forced to. And it's sort of like the honor system. And I think that's been a real challenge.
Yeah, there's a mix of self-policing here that we all have a responsibility to do at this point that cannot just fall on bylaw enforcement officers.
Exactly. They're asking us, for example, one of the main things I think people probably are experiencing now on a daily, weekly basis is wearing masks when you go into a business. So when you get your groceries or when you pick up a coffee, they're really relying on businesses to police that. So if I walk into a coffee shop without my mask, hopefully that business owner or the person at the cash is saying, hey, excuse me, can you please put on a mask? We have a policy, the city has a bylaw. We're not all perfect. And I think bylaw knows that there are going to be instances where there will be sort of blatant disregard of the rules. And that's where they're trying to focus their limited resources.
I had a quick question too about especially the mask wearing bylaw that was passed really quickly. Is it unusual for a bylaw to move that quickly through city council? Obviously, it's one of big importance that probably has a different kind of priority than a lot of other bylaws do, but is it unusual to see something of that scope move that quickly through City Hall?
Yeah, it's definitely unusual. Under the emergency declaration, the mayor actually has special powers where he can essentially put rules in place without council's approval. And we saw some of that earlier on. There have been other bylaws that have been approved by council recently where there honestly wasn't very much debate. There was sort of general agreement that this was something that was necessary. I think that's because these changes are being backed by Toronto Public Health as necessary to help prevent virus spread. And so it's sort of difficult for councillors to argue with the science of that, I think. But certainly in the past, some of the largest council debates have been about bylaws. For example, they had to pass a bylaw to regulate Ubers and vehicles for hire. And that went on for years.
So you spoke to Carlton Grant, sort of the head of the bylaw department for the City of Toronto. Here in Toronto, we're not moving into stage 3 yet. We could get there as soon as next week. What worries does Carlton Grant have around bylaws once things like indoor dining or restaurants reopen and they have a huge other set of things to worry about now?
Yeah, so one of the things that we talked about was about some of that sort of blatant disregard for the rules. And so they've been going out to sort of problem patio areas. So patio outdoor dining is allowed right now. And they're getting complaints about some areas. For example, they were on King West recently. So they're looking for overcrowding of patios and also where dining is moving indoors, which is happening. And they're really concerned about, restaurant and bar owners who aren't adhering to the patio rules when they are allowed to have patrons also eating and drinking indoors. What will happen? Because you're just exponentially increasing the number of people you have in one space together. And there are a lot of concerns about the rules for bars and restaurants under stage 3. There's seemingly a contradiction here where when I go to the grocery store, I have to put a mask on. But if I go to a bar in stage 3, I don't have to put a mask on to drink with my friends. And the mayor and Toronto Public Health have been speaking out about that. They've asked the premier to modify some of the rules, and bylaw is very much in support of that letter that the mayor sent to the premier. The rules really, if you could sum them up, are about trying to keep people from moving around any space. When you go to a bar, you're not necessarily seated in one spot with your friends. You might move around. Lots of bars in the city have like games you can play or other things to interact with that's not necessarily at a table. And they're really concerned about having people sort of floating around an indoor space without wearing masks. So that's one of the things that bylaw and Carlton said specifically is he's worried that if they can't get the patio situation under control, that it's only going to get worse once we let people eat and drink indoors.
Yeah, it's like running before you've really learned how to walk.
Exactly.
There's still a lot of people who aren't following those rules even right now. Opening up to indoor dining is a whole other set of challenges that maybe we're not prepared for yet.
Yeah, I think Carlton and his team doesn't have control over when we get to the next stage. All they can control is what they're able to enforce. And, there's an issue there if they think the rules are not strong enough to keep people safe. I think that's why you've seen the mayor and public health advocating for changes to the stage 3 protocols. I think Carlton believes that with stronger measures that we might see better outcomes.
You had a quote of his in your piece that struck me, and he said that if everything is a priority, then nothing is a priority. In the same way that it can be really tough for all of us to learn about a new rule or a new bylaw or best practices every single day, do you think it's the same for people who are doing the enforcing?
Yeah, I think that was really telling. I think it's been a huge challenge for them, and I was grateful that he was really open to talking about it. We've seen a lot of news stories, for example, about large gatherings in parks. The one that everyone knows about is everyone getting together on that weekend in Trinity Bellwoods. And, that's the kind of blatant disregard for the rules that we've been talking about. But at the same time, we know that there weren't any publicly reported cases of COVID coming out of that gathering. We know that you are less likely to contract the virus in outdoor settings, although it's not impossible. So at the same time, like we were speaking about earlier, there's all of these other bylaws that they are responsible for enforcing. And when you have such a high profile situation like that, I think there's an expectation that they sort of crack down. And they did. They sent all kinds of enforcement officers and police to the park. They painted chalk circles to try to keep people at a distance when they do go to the park. They expended a lot of resources on that one situation. And at the same time, there are other parts of the city that we know that are being harder hit, that are having a harder time. And we're not necessarily looking into how we can help with enforcement in those respects.
Yeah, what's being left behind right now? Because bylaw enforcement officers have had to shift their focus. Like, what parts of the city or different programs are being left behind because they have something else to focus on right now?
So one of the things I talked to Carlton about was the apartments bylaw. It's a relatively new bylaw where they are enforcing sort of cleaning and sanitation standards on a regular day. This was before the pandemic. And then very recently, during the pandemic, council also applied additional enhanced measures for landlords to clean common areas, to keep people who live in these congregate settings, apartment buildings, safe. And that includes things like putting hand sanitizer or a hand washing station at the front entrance of a building and, wiping down elevator buttons and that kind of thing. But there have been zero enforcement officers dedicated to that bylaw. And we know from some of the reporting of our colleagues that there are parts of the city, like the Northwest Corner, that are apartment heavy, that have experienced a high number of cases and a disproportionate number of cases from close contact. We're waiting to see more information from public health about the housing status of those people, but there is a fear that underhousing in those parts of the city and the inability to distance and perhaps the issue of people congregating in common areas and the lack of cleaning are contributing to the spread of the virus. And we just aren't enforcing those rules. And again, there's only so many officers. And if they're focused on places like Trinity Bellwoods, then they're not focused on making sure that landlords are following those types of rules. And obviously there are hundreds of thousands of apartment units across the city.
We talked about a little bit earlier about enforcement, and that there's, in a certain sense, just because of resources and how many officers there are, there's only so much that they can do. And yes, they are in charge of enforcing, but it's also down to us. Is there any thought around how enforcement works? Is ticketing actually the way to go here? Like, can you actually enforce people to follow the rules properly?
Yeah, I think certainly with this number of officers, the feeling amongst city officials is that the enforcement piece is sort of a last resort. They really are hoping that by educating the public about the new rules, by doing these frequent press conferences so that the word gets out through us and our colleagues in the media, that people will voluntarily follow the rules, knowing that, of course, there will always be rule breakers. And there are new challenges, right? Like something that Carlton mentioned to me was that normally Parks is used to putting out one or two fires, for example, on the waterfront from people who are hanging out there, but they're seeing a super increased number of people having fires, and Parks is having to go around in the morning and like put out fires, and people are barbecuing and smoldering coals being left on the beach, which are...
You meant literal fires. You meant literal fires.
Yes, like actual fires.
I thought you meant like metaphorically.
No,
I was
literal,
like, yeah, that makes sense.
literal
Okay.
fires. Yes, so people are having bonfires and then barbecues and dumping their coals on the beach. And that's like a new thing that they're trying to figure out. They're like, this is actually a very serious public hazard. And because people are not able to congregate indoors. And so they're doing it outside. And for some reason, they feel the need to do that with an actual fire. And that's causing a lot of new challenges for city staff. And so I'm not sure that having more staff would help. They're literally putting out fires in the real and metaphorical sense. And so even if you had enough officers to have enforcement officers standing outside every single business in the city to ensure people were wearing masks when they went in, not only is that not really practical or economical, I think you'd still have people finding a way to skirt the rules. And so I think they're really hoping that by making the rules as clear as possible to people, that, again, that you're sort of following this honor system and that that it's a temporary measure.
Kind of on a larger scope, I'm really interested by this because of how this ties into how we as a city are thinking about public space and how we use that space, and how, given there's so many people out on the streets now, we're all trying to navigate, like, give each other the right amount of space and be respectful of each other, and sort of how bylaws fit into that. Do you think that they play into how we're navigating this weird pandemic world that we're living in and how we use public space?
Yeah, I do feel like there's this push and pull. Like early on in the pandemic, people were getting ticketed for stopping on park benches. And then they pulled that back because they realized people just needed a second to sit outside as long as they weren't sitting in a large group. And there's similar questions about, should bylaw really be enforcing people sitting and having like a beer with their friends in the park when it's much safer for them to be doing it in the park than it would be for them to, say, be doing it in a condo or an apartment? At the same time, that rule does exist, and they obviously want to prevent the types of situations they've seen where people are bringing entire cases of beer to the park. Again, that kind of blatant disregard. But given the fact that people have been putting up with having to be apart and follow all these rules, for more than 4 months now, there's a question of, should we be lenient in one sense, as long as we are following the wearing the mask inside, the socially distancing? And I think we're rethinking a lot of the way we use public space because of this. I've seen people just using parks differently. In my area, we have the city really rapidly figuring out how to set up sidewalk and curb lane patios, which, if you had asked me if the city was going to be able to figure out how to do policy for, the kinds of patio spaces you see in your favorite European cities, I would have told you were dreaming, but they figured it out.
Yeah, Toronto's not generally a city that moves super quick on things like that, but in this time they have.
And, it's under immense pressure because a lot of these businesses are really suffering. You have businesses that have always relied on dine-in customers, and they've tried to pivot to takeout. Maybe it's not really working for them. They've tried to sell their alcohol. Maybe that's not working. And so even having this small patio space might keep them afloat and might help them cover their expenses. And so the city honestly did that at a pace that frankly surprised me. And they are continuing to roll out, one just opened down the street from me, and we're continuing to see them pop up as they sort of mark off the spaces and provide the separation, planters or poles. And so that's some of the ways I think that the city is adjusting. And I think there are lots of things that we could actually keep from the pandemic, which is sort of an interesting idea just going forward. But of course, it will involve having to enforce, there are rules about sidewalk patios that enforcement is responsible for.
Looking through your crystal ball here a little bit for this last question, do you think anything from this time will actually stick around, whether it's bike lanes or outdoor patios? Is any of this going to stick around for, 2 or 3 years from now when hopefully this is all over?
I think that it's possible, for example, the sidewalk cafes, if they could figure out a way to make them permanent, to make them safe, to make them economically viable for restaurants, I could see that staying. One of the biggest fights we have in the city is about our road space, about parking, about room for cars. And so things like more bike lanes, they installed bike lanes on University, which frankly, now that they're there, I'm surprised that they haven't always been there. Like, that is a major commuting route for people, whether you're driving, cycling, or taking the subway, but there was never a cycling lane there. And so I think it's forced us to reconsider everyone's needs in this and not just those sort of traditional people who win out in council fights. For example, drivers tend to dominate when it comes to decisions made about road space. But because we've had to find a way for people to distance outside of their cars, we've gotten all of these new urban upgrades that maybe we want to keep. And that's something definitely worth talking about.
Jen, thank you for breaking it down for us.
Thank you.
And that's our City Hall reporter, Jennifer Pagliaro, breaking down bylaws and maybe making you think twice about them now. That's it for today. Thanks for listening. This Matters is hosted and produced by me, Adrian Cheung, Saba Aitazaz, and Raju Mutar. Produced and mixed by Sean Pattinen, and our director of programming is JP Fozo. Our show theme music is by So Called, and our episode music is by Mike DeAngelis. We want to hear what stories matter to you. Please send us comments, questions, or ideas to thismatters@thestar.ca. Please consider supporting the journalism the Toronto Star newsroom does at thestar.com. And don't forget to subscribe to This Matters on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Let's talk soon.